Welcome to MAIS Member Voices. I'm Scott Donaldson, Member Engagement Director at the National Association of Independent Schools. This month, Jackie Wolking speaks with Christopher Kramaric, Chief Advancement Officer at Church Farm School in Exton, Pennsylvania. Christopher shares how his school advances its mission of providing a college preparatory education to all boys through innovative fundraising and community engagement. He discusses the school's unique history as a working farm, the evolution of its advancement strategy, and creative approaches to building partnerships with businesses, alumni, and local organizations. Christopher also reflects on his personal journey to independent schools, the importance of storytelling and relationship building in philanthropy, and how experiential learning and community connections prepare students for a debt-free future. Here's Jackie.
Thanks, Scott. Christopher, welcome to Member Voices.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here.
Great. Well, I was hoping we could start with just a bit of context. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about Church Farm School, like the history and mission, and what really makes the school unique?
Absolutely. I'd be glad to. Church Farm School, as the name suggests, is an Episcopal school. We're an all-boys boarding school, grades 9 through 12, and we're located just outside of Philadelphia. But what makes us somewhat unique is our history as both a working farm and as a school. We were founded in 1918 by the Reverend Charles W. Schreiner, affectionately known to those of us here at the farm as the Colonel. His history was such that his father had left his family, and he was taken by the idea of what it would mean to offer boys an education who otherwise would be locked outside of that opportunity, as he felt he had been. So as the legend goes, he would come to the place that is now our campus alongside Lincoln Highway, and the farmers there would ask him what he was doing, and he would tell them that one day he was going to open a school for boys. And he did that in 1918, opening Church Farm School as a school explicitly for fatherless boys and those who would otherwise not be able to afford an education. The working farm that he started alongside the school was his means of ensuring that students could attend at little to no cost to their families. So throughout our history, the boys who attended Church Farm School would work the farm. We had hogs, cattle, we grew peonies, produced scrapple and sausage, and they would attend school in the other half of the day. And the operations of the farm then, the proceeds from that, were how the colonel and then eventually his son, who became our second headmaster, managed the operations of the school and upheld that foundational promise to educational access. In the 1970s and 1980s, during the farm crisis, and as laws changed, the farm operations were wound down. But during that time, through the generosity of a number of friends and neighbors, our campus had grown to more than 2,000 acres. So when farm operations eventually wound down, our board and the leaders of the school at that time made the decision to sell land to build an endowment to be able to uphold that foundational promise and continue to admit boys who otherwise would not be able to access a college preparatory high school education were it not for our support. So today we leverage that endowment as well as the philanthropic generosity of a number of our friends, neighbors, and alumni to award about $7 million every year to 150 boys in grades 9 through 12. Every single one of our students is on financial aid. That is, I think, one of the biggest things that differentiates us. We're not just a college preparatory school, but we're a college preparatory school that's really committed to the idea of building debt-free futures for young men. And we know that that begins in our halls, and then it continues on as they move into post-secondary life. So we put a lot of emphasis on finding the right college and making sure that students are not only choosing a school that fits them academically and socially, but also one that fits them financially so that they can launch into life in a way that they're free of that sort of material and psychic burden of debt. So that's sort of what sets us apart, I think, in some way, is the fact that we have a mission as a school, but in some way we're also a bit of a nonprofit because we have this foundational promise that we have to uphold to increase educational access and equity.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into that some more. So talk to us about how, selling off the land, creating that endowment, and then also relying on some of your philanthropic partners. Like, what has that looked like since the 80s and 90s when you made that shift and sold that big portion of land? I mean, it's an incredible commitment that you're adhering to. And what kind of challenges and opportunities have you found along the way to continue that kind of accessibility goal for the school?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that, brought me here and preoccupies a lot of my thinking. I think throughout the 90s and the aughts and into the 2010s, there were a number of different ways that we approached the challenge of closing the gap. Because even though we have the endowment that we do, there is still a hefty gap. We continue to operate on 160 acres across 28 buildings. And so when you look at those costs at various moments throughout time, we've tried to approach that from a tuition revenue standpoint, whether that was increasing recruitment efforts for international students who were paying higher tuition rates to offset that gap, or whether it was beginning, as I have done, to push more heavily into philanthropy and fundraising. It is a unique challenge because many folks see our endowment and think, well, you are set up for success. And that is true. But we leverage that endowment at this point to offset the cost of that financial aid that we supply to our families. So current year, we have about a $6 million gap. And that means going out and fundraising. Now, the additional challenge that comes with that fundraising is, of course, in school world, I've worked in schools before. The way that you often approach fundraising is that you turn to your parents and your grandparents, sometimes your aunts and uncles, and your alums for so much of your fundraising support. By our very model, of course, in serving the students that we do serve, our parents and our grandparents are not in a position to necessarily be the heart of our philanthropic support. So that means we have to find a way to welcome in friends, introduce new people to the school, introduce businesses to the school in order to bring them in, hopefully, to those giving circles after a certain amount of time. There are two other things that I'll mention just by way of context. One is that Pennsylvania, like many other states, has a program that's called the Educational Improvement Tax Credit Program, EITC. So if we recruit Pennsylvania students to our school who fall below a certain income level or live within the bounds of a low performing school within the Commonwealth, those students are able to have scholarships provided through this tax credit program. So right now we're doing a lot to build out that program, to partner with area businesses and individuals to have them redirect their PA tax liability to Church Farm School for student scholarships. The other thing that is sort of adjacent to our fundraising puzzle that we have to put together is the fact that we're a boarding school. There are perceptions in the wider community that this might be a reform school. I think we are now working to do a better job to bring in our friends and neighbors so that they can meet our boys. We just had a luncheon here on campus this week with 60 civic and business leaders so that we can work to change those perceptions in the broader community. I hear from so many people. I've driven past your campus for years and I had no idea what was going on there. And I think that's the function of being a homegrown boarding school that was once a farm that then managed to create an endowment that is sizable and for many years maybe didn't need to go beyond the walls in order to sustain operations beyond the sort of operating of the farm. So that's a new adventure for us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to the business partnerships, but also maybe before we get there, you also have a lot of just community partners. I was looking around on the website and there was, I think, 16 different community-based organizations that you're kind of working with. And I wonder, how did those relationships come about? What has it been like to kind of manage the partnership element with just kind of other area local nonprofits?
Absolutely. This luncheon we had earlier this week, we do it twice annually. We call it our Griffin Scholars Luncheon. It began years ago as a way to thank existing supporters, and over time, we have begun to evolve it into an opportunity to welcome new friends into the school. And that's not just new friends from the business community or the chambers, but also a number of nonprofit partners in the area. For us, those nonprofit partners, because they're often working in the communities in which we want to recruit students, they play a big role in our recruitment and admissions efforts, especially locally now, as we think about our ability to leverage the Pennsylvania state tax credits to fund student scholarships. Those credits can only be awarded to students who have residency in Pennsylvania. So thinking about our partners in our neighboring cities and towns, a city down the road from here called Coatesville, an old steel town, that's where I grew up, Norristown, Kennett Square. There are a number of communities, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, and of course Philadelphia, where we know there are pockets of need and we know we can find students. So having community partners and nonprofit partners who can be sort of trusted advisors and go-betweens as we're reaching into communities and asking for their trust, that's really critical. Our other big base of community partners is situated in northern New Jersey and New York. Throughout the New York metropolitan region, there's a really robust network of CBOs, we call them community-based organizations, that are reaching in and identifying students at the middle school level, bringing them into out-of-school time programming, whether that's after school on the weekends or in the summer, to prepare them to apply for a competitive independent school college preparatory education. So over the years, as we've really honed in on being a college preparatory school, those partnerships made a lot of sense for us. Those students are coming in prepared for the challenges of our curriculum. They understand some of what the expectations will be in an independent school setting. But as with all things in schools, it's a balancing act for us. We really love those partnerships and our students who come through them, but it could be very easy for us to say, let's get all of these kids who have been pulled out of their standard middle school in New York City and shown what they can expect when they come to a college prep school. So what we're really working hard to do is make sure that we're maintaining that balance. We want those students here, but we also realize Philadelphia or those cities I mentioned nearby to us, Coatesville, Norristown, Harrisburg, they may not have that same network of academically focused community-based organizations, but there are still students there who we think it is our mission and our founder's dream that we find and bring to our school. So that, of course, means we have to think really strategically about our programming, our support services. What do we have in place in terms of academic tutoring, social emotional support, mental health counseling? When you're working with students who are coming out of a low performing school district or out of a lower income neighborhood, the number of things you might have to address, whether those are academic deficiencies or perhaps a history of trauma, we have to take that into account, because one of the things we're really committed to as a school is if we say we're going to open the doors for you, we want you to come in here, we're going to take a chance on you, we don't actually want to take a chance on a kid. We want to know that we're going to get him to the finish line. It's not fair to promise a young man and his family something and then say, actually, this was actually more than we bargained for. So we're really committed to making sure that we work closely with our community partners to understand the students who are coming our way and to create that right balance to really give them a sort of rich cohort and a rich student experience while they're here on our campus.
Yeah, has that created some kind of like unique positions at the school where you're offering kind of tutoring in-house through the school? Do you outsource that? I mean, a lot of those support services, are those run with your community partners or actually through the school?
That's interesting. So right now we're in the process of expanding our counseling team and our academic support team. And as we do that, we are working with some external partners. It can go back and forth. When we're talking about, for instance, I had a number of students who had lost a parent, and we worked with a local nonprofit specializing in adolescent and teen grief counseling. So to bring those services in to supplement the experts we have in house is something we look to do. And then, of course, sort of reaching back out to those community partners, because we are a boarding school. We have about 10% of our students are day students, so they live, let's say within 15 or 20 minutes of the campus. But a majority of our students are boarding students, which means that at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, in the summer, they're going back into their home neighborhood, back into their home. And for many, that's wonderful. And for many, that might be a moment where they're pulled back into something that they're not anticipating or that they're not looking forward to going back into. And so what that means for us is maintaining really close working relationships with those community partners who are our feeders of these students, to make sure that those wraparound supports are present for them when they're not on our campus. Even though we're in loco parentis when they're here, that sort of responsibility extends beyond just the time they're in residence on our campus.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I wanted to go back to the business partners. So you'd mentioned a couple kind of ways to bring those folks on site, get them, kind of understanding and seeing and experiencing the school. I think there's a number of programs maybe that you're developing or thinking about implementing that we'd love to hear more about. One is that public programs and events at the farm. It sounds like you've done events that have brought in more community partners. It's really drummed up a lot of interest. It's got, a chance to again bring the community together. And I'm just wondering what kind of results you're seeing from that or other kind of innovative strategies that you've tried.
Thank you for asking that. Yes. So working with area business partners, we understand on the advancement side of the house that is going to be critical to closing the gap that we have to close every year, because so many of these businesses and the individuals who are attached to them, whether they're the CEO or a number of employees who are working at that company, businesses and individuals can take part in these state tax credit programs that are directed towards scholarships. So for us, the capacity there is, the sky is kind of the limit. And so the question does become, how do we engage with our business partners? And, as part of my entrance to the organization, I worked with our board of trustees and other members of the senior leadership team to put together an expansion plan for the Office of Institutional Advancement. When I arrived, there were 3 members of the team reporting up to me. There are now 7 reporting up to me, and within the next 2 years, we plan to add 4 or 5 more. Now, that's across our frontline fundraising, our development function, our advancement services and operations function, and our marketing, communications, and alumni relations functions. But when we think about how we bring in those businesses and even individuals in some ways, it's a question of how we push beyond what's expected. We are, of course, very active in 5 or 6 chambers of commerce that are centered here in Chester County or out of Philadelphia. We work with area rotaries. And of course, when we have board members who are parts of companies, we do our very best to make sure that we're working with their broader team to build awareness. But one of the things we've launched this year is public programs and events at the farm. The idea was to put together a series of, as the name suggests, public programs and events that would appeal to a broader public, a public who is living right here in Chester County and has maybe driven past our school for years and they have no idea who we are or what we do, and get them in the door. Make sure that these programs in some way reflect back to the broader public something about our philosophy and who we are as an institution. The kinds of events that offer a sort of a feeling of belonging and position us as maybe a hub for cultural exchange and conversation. And then, of course, when you create an event like that, if you can bring in the right level of, say, author or speaker, there are a lot of opportunities to then reach out to area businesses and talk to them about cause marketing and sponsorship opportunities. So that's what we've done. In March of this year, just about a month ago, we had our inaugural event in the series and welcomed Pulitzer Prize-winning author Percival Everett, the author of James, to campus. He was here on Friday, March 27th. That evening, one of my sort of commitments in creating this public programs and events series is that everyone we bring to campus, I want them to have a meaningful experience outside of the ordinary with our boys. And then I also want them to have this sort of moment of big public engagement. So when Professor Everett was here, we hosted a fireside chat in our head of schools residence with 20 of our young men, all of them in discussion with Professor Everett about his book, about his process, about the things that he wished he had known when he was 16 years old. And then we went to our Chapel of the Atonement, a beautiful, beautiful space, the heart of our campus, which we had sold out. So about 400 guests joined us in the chapel for Professor Everett's keynote. And after that, we made our way back to the head of schoolhouse for a select reception where he did a live book signing, and we gathered together with friends and supporters. So that opened a lot of opportunities. Out of that came a few sponsorships, including one where the sponsor stepped forward and said, I really want this to become a series. So let's work together and let's figure out what happens next. So that's really exciting. And we were able to bring in, as I said, people who have never been on our campus, and the reaction was just sort of overwhelming. In fact, one of the most special moments of the night, I think, was when Professor Everett took to the podium in the Chapel of the Atonement, and he sort of looked out on the crowd, and then his first words were, "I never knew a school like this existed in the world, and now I'm happy." And that sort of moment was just a real sort of crystallization of the, my biggest hopes for what this sort of series could be. So we're moving forward with that. This fall, we're going to host our first traveling exhibition from a letterpress artist named Amos Paul Kennedy Jr. in our Buck Family Center for the Arts. It'll be our first exhibition in the gallery. We'll be hosting it for 3 months. And what we're doing with that is we'll use that space as a backdrop for some smaller author events. Bring in, let's say, 100 to 125 members of the public. Again, get them on campus, say hello to them, get them feeling like Church Farm School is a part of civic and cultural life here in Chester County, and they should be paying attention to us. But we're also going to use that space, the gallery space, as a backdrop for a number of chamber and Rotary events. So we have a number of chambers who do after work happy hours. So we've scheduled those throughout the fall. Another great moment to bring in members of the business community, show off a really cool space, show off a really fantastic exhibit that allows us to open conversations about our history. One of the things that's fascinating about Amos Paul Kennedy Jr.'s work is it's letterpress work. He mostly reflects back the words of civil rights activists. And so, pardon me, he mostly reflects back the words of civil rights activists. That speaks to the diversity of our school community. But in addition to running the farm back in the day, we also had a print shop here on campus that a number of our students worked in. And so to bring the tradition of letterpress back into our campus, to bring alumni and current students together, we'll have the artist visit and do some letterpress workshops with them. It's an interesting way to really honor our past, be able to talk about it in a natural way to these new friends who are coming in and helping us build our present and our future.
I'm curious, are there any other, like, innovative advancement strategies that you're thinking through at the moment? You had mentioned kind of, like, putting those puzzle pieces together to fill that gap. Like, what else is Church Farm School thinking about right now?
Yeah. So on the advancement sort of fundraising front, we are thinking really differently about plan giving and about church relations. Those are big areas for us. We are 108 years old, so we have a number of alums, a number of widows of alums who have expressed to us in the past that they intend to support us. So going out and really putting some weight behind those relationships, nurturing those relationships, talking to them about what their plans are, it helps us plan for the future in a different way, but also sort of actively recruiting folks to think about plan giving or asset-based giving is a new adventure for us. I think in a lot of times in the past, those kinds of gifts happened to us. So that's really exciting, and it goes alongside a sort of broader, I think, reframing for us. We talk a lot at Church Farm School about brotherhood. One of the things we've been doing with alumni, my head of school began in July of this past year, but when he was named, we began traveling together in April of last year before he even started. And I had an event in Washington, D.C. last winter where we had hoped a number of alums would show up, and like 3 or 4 showed up. And they were all from different years, like very different years, like different decades. And I was like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? And I was shocked because they hit it off in such a way. Like they closed down we left, my team left before they left. We were getting text messages from them later. And so I said to my team, including my director of alumni relations, I was like, what if we started putting together dinners, really like invite specific, not like a broad, hey, come to a happy hour, but dinners that we called decades dinners. And we went to a city and we picked one guy from every decade. If we can get a guy from the 50s, great, but 60s on up through the 2020s. And we brought them together around a table. And so the first time we did that was in Atlanta of March of last year. And we had one guy from every decade from the 70s up through the 2020s. And I think we've now done probably half a dozen of these or more, and smaller versions when we can't get one guy from every decade. We do our best to bring guys together with other guys who they weren't on campus with at the same time. And that's been a real innovation for us, because what ends up happening, when our guys talk about brotherhood, of course they're thinking about the brothers they were here with at the time. But then you get around a table with them, and it may start out slow, but little by little they start telling stories. And of course they like rib the young guy, and they're like, you don't know how to castrate a pig. And you're like, oh my gosh, this was an entirely different school at one point in time, right? And we have to figure out how to cohere this school around a central belief, right? There's the farm era, there's the farm closing down era, like there's all of these moments in its history. And by the end of those dinners, you can say to them, like, do you see how like every one of you are brothers? And like you don't have to say it, they're the ones who say it. And then the pivot that we've been able to take from that, I would say, myself and my head of school, is to then say, and there's a boy being born right now who is also your brother. And so what we need you to do is to make possible what was made possible for you. And so the conversations we're having around plan giving, around the relationship to the school more broadly in terms of philanthropy, has just been so enriching and moving in a lot of instances, to be able to honor brotherhood, to be able to honor the history of this school, but to also sit across from guys who I think for a number of years were sort of thinking, well, that school's not my school anymore, right? Could I even get in there today? To be able to sit with them and say, like, this is still the same place, and you're bound together in this brotherhood. We've really used that to inform a lot of our advancement strategies. On the other front, I will mention our church relations outreach. We're an Episcopal school, as I mentioned, and we're one of only 3 Episcopal schools in the Philadelphia region. We work very closely with a number of churches. That was actually how our founder secured the land that he secured all those years ago, and how he maintained operations. I've heard talk that at its biggest, he had this Christmas fund that he would run. That was sort of the extent of our philanthropy department throughout most of the 20th century. There was a Christmas fund, and he would write personally to everyone in the fund. And at its height, the records I've seen suggest that there were somewhere between like 18 to 20,000 people on his mailing list. He had been featured in the Saturday Evening Post and in a number of magazines. And so that sort of tradition, though, was really rooted in the Episcopal communities here in Philadelphia. If you made a gift, then the boys would be sent out on the trucks with homemade scrapple or sausage, and they'd deliver it to your home to thank you for your gift. And so I think over time, especially with the inauguration of the endowment, some of those traditions faded away. Now, of course, we are not making, for those of you from the Philadelphia region, we're not making scrapple. If you don't know what scrapple is, you can look it up. We're not making sausage anymore, and we're not driving down the highway to deliver it. But we really feel strongly that those church connections are critical relationships for us, not just in terms of finding volunteers who can help on our campus in things like our Griffin Clothes Closet, where we make business attire available and toiletries available to our students, but eventually building out, again, a wider network of friends and neighbors who might be moved to become supporters. So those 2 areas of advancement are really exciting right now, the sort of alumni plan giving sector, and then this sort of church relations arm that we've put some real investment and energy behind. On the other side of the advancement house, which is our marketing and communication side, we're really diving into that right now. We, as I think I mentioned earlier, we see ourselves as a school, but I always remind folks that we're also a nonprofit, almost more like a visitor-based institution in a lot of ways. And that means that we have to reach out to a number of different audiences. We have kind of a dual customer problem, right? We need to both recruit students, which might mean appealing to a 13-year-old boy or his mom, who's often the decision maker. They're going to respond to 2 different messages. Mom's going to respond to, hey, this could be affordable. But if you've ever had a teenager, you know that they're rarely moved by the idea that they'll choose the cheapest option to keep things light for the parents, right? They want to know you have a school that they want to attend. So we're thinking a lot on the marketing communications front about how we appeal to each of those segments, but then also how we make sure that we have a public presence that can appeal to a donor base or a potential donor base that is separate from our sort of core consumer, if you will.
No, these have been fantastic examples. I'd love to hear more. I mean, you'd mentioned earlier in the conversation about the size of your team. So it sounds like you're doing so much on this front, really innovative work. And I'm just curious, like, it's a fairly large team that you're running, and like, how can you just walk me through like that evolution and where you're headed, but also more importantly, like the systems that make it run really well? And any advice you could give to schools that maybe don't have as large as a team that you do, and what they can do, or maybe lessons learned along the way as you kind of create that coordinated approach to institutional advancement, from all the kind of strategies of building that brotherhood to engaging partners to marketing and recruitment. I mean, this is such a huge function. I'm just curious, as your team grows, what are you most concerned about and what are you most excited about? And how do you keep that machine running really well?
That is the big question. So, in terms of building out the team, coming in to Church Farm School, one of my central sort of claims or arguments to the board and to senior leadership was that we have not had a development function here truly, right? We grew out of a mom and pop shop, as I mentioned, that was, sending out Christmas fun letters and delivering scrapple and sausage. And then over the last, say, 15, 20 years as a development office sort of took shape, the staffing structure was such that we had a director of development, we had someone who was overseeing communications and someone who was overseeing alumni relations, but we didn't really have anyone who was trained up as a frontline fundraiser. And that director of development, we saw a lot of turnover in that seat. Some amazing people worked here, and I'm friends with a lot of them, but they weren't staffed for success, if I'm being honest. And so one of my first sort of moves when I got in here was to say, let's look at other organizations and let's understand what we think a staffing structure would need to look like in order to return the kind of contributed revenue that's going to help us close this gap and steward our endowment in a way that ensures the sustainability of the school. So we did a lot of research during my first year at the school to sort of benchmark. That's hard, of course, because we are in some ways in a subset of one, right? People will often draw analogies between Church Farm School and Milton Hershey, but of course, Milton Hershey was founded by a billionaire. We were founded by a, fatherless Episcopal minister with like a dream in his heart, and somehow fortuitously, some things happened with, the development of the county we sit in and the land that we had that has allowed us to persist to this day. So we benchmarked against a number of organizations as best we could. That meant looking at, back 4-year residential baccalaureate institutions that have similarly sized endowments. And then I began to sort of look at where the biggest questions were on the fundraising front. And to my mind, the 3 biggest questions were, would an investment in planned giving make a difference for us? Would an investment in an annual giving and stewardship role make a difference for us? And would an investment in someone dedicated to church and tax credits make a difference? And so those were the roles that we decided to hire in. And a lot of that conversation was about testing, right? What do we think is possible? We don't really know. There hadn't been a sort of large scale analysis of our database in a while. So in terms of systems right now with that, so that's the team I've brought on. I will say the first hire I made, which I had an existing line for this hire when I came in, was my director of advancement operations. And I knew that was going to perhaps be the most critical role I was going to fill early on, because I needed someone who could dig down into who was already in our database and could help me think about systems in a way. And so we've implemented a number of things together. My director of advancement operations and I, along with the rest of the team, we've moved CRMs. Actually, just before I joined you today, she very excitedly came to tell me that Bloomerang is live. That's the CRM we've moved to. Part of our reasoning for doing that was to think about what our needs are as a fundraising team in terms of building out portfolios and also managing communication workflows. And we want to make sure that as we're adding lots of new people to our circle, right, who could be potential donors, how are we able to segment them? How are we able to communicate with them effectively? Within our own team, I've implemented some steps to make us communicate or help us communicate more effectively. We have a no email rule in our team. We communicate exclusively in Teams, and we have instituted some really robust ways of managing files. And I know that sounds mundane, but I think anyone who has worked in an office understands what it means when you're sort of searching continuously and kind of trying to manage your external facing responsibilities in an inbox alongside the sort of deluge of daily conversation that happens within a team. So we've worked to separate those two things out and think about our file system so that we're good to ourselves and good to those who come after us. And then I would say within that team, it's been a lot of getting around the table, as sort of old fashioned as that seems. And that's not always my first inclination. I think I've learned a lot working at Church Farm and working with the team that I have reporting to me and my fellow senior leaders. I'm someone who loves a big knot in need of unraveling, and it's kind of always sort of running in the back of my mind. And then when I come to an idea with people, we talk about it, and I'm ready to hit the ground running. And I've realized that a lot of times you need to talk about it more than that. And so we have small sort of subgroups of our team that meet weekly or biweekly on a couple of different topics right now. And those topics sort of evolve over time. So right now, the key ones for us are portfolio development. as we make our way through wealth screenings and the existing database, getting the team of frontline fundraisers together and making decisions about who's in whose portfolio, what are our agreed upon practices when it comes to qualification. How many times do I expect you to call or to email before we say this person is a no-go? So just getting around the table and making those decisions, those processes, those policies, procedures haven't existed for the team. The other thing we're meeting around right now, our sort of other big subgroup, is around stewardship and prospect research. So as we welcome, as I mentioned, for the public programs and events series, that was about, I want to say it was maybe about 250 new donors to the school out of that event. So what do we do with those names? How do we make sure we don't just throw them into our big email list and scare them off? How do we cultivate them? How do we understand who's in that group? Are there folks who are in need of greater attention? But then also, when someone does choose to become a supporter, what are our sustainable stewardship practices? Because those have not existed here. So we come from a tradition where, as I mentioned, the colonel and his son who followed him would write handwritten letters to all of the supporters, and there is something that is lost when you don't do that. And I do a lot of handwriting, but how do we make sure that what we're building is something that can sustain itself if we are going to realize the growth that we have in front of us? And we're also now looking at, in terms of the machine, sort of how do we rethink our marketing and communications function, and probably lean more heavily into what I would call a content and engagement frame, leaning more heavily on video and photography, and thinking about the spaces where we need to engage right now. My senior leaders and I will often talk about what we see on Instagram and what we see on Facebook. And then after we're done, I'll remind them we're all looking there because we're all of a certain age, but our target demographic is 13-year-old boys, and they're not there. They're on TikTok. So we're thinking about how we can continue to build out some systems that also fold our students in beyond just, say, our traditional ambassadors program where students give tours for prospective students or for visiting donors. I have students involved in letter writing to supporters of the school, but we're thinking about, what does it look like to weave boys into being a TikTok team for us. And I've had conversations. I've sat at tables with alums who will talk to me about how different the school is today, and how they were on the milk squad. And I've said to some of them, the milk squad of today might actually be my team of TikTokers, because that is going to support the operation of the school in the same way that you getting up at 4 a.m. and milking those cows did all those years ago. In terms of systems, I think right now we are kind of building the plane as we're trying to fly it. And what I'm really trying to focus on as a leader is making sure that I'm over communicating and bringing people around the table so they feel bought in, and also understand that we're in a place right now that might look different 2 or 3 years from now. It means that some of my frontline fundraisers are doing a lot more qualification work than they might be otherwise, because we're not staffed up to say, here's your portfolio of 100 people who are just ready and raring to have a conversation with you. And so it really is a team effort there.
Yeah, no, I think it's really helpful just to hear you paint the picture and tell the story about, what was challenging in the beginning when you first started, how you've built some of the systems and the relationships. I'm sure folks will be reaching out after they listen to this to hear about more about that no email rule, because I'm sure we're just, overwhelmed with our inboxes too
It's
much.
the
But
so much. Why have we done this
yeah,
to ourselves?
why?
I will say one other sort of, and this is maybe a silly thing, but we've been doing a lot of outreach to alums and to donors who maybe haven't heard from us in a while. So two of the most useful tools we have, as silly as it sounds, are subscriptions to white pages and been verified, because we have out of date information. And I've worked really hard on a personal level. Like, it's there's a lot of anxiety that comes along with picking up the phone and trying to call someone, and that just amps itself up if you're not sure that you have the right number. So I've really worked with the team as I've been going out and traveling around the country to meet with alums and I can't get a hold of someone. We pull that list out of white pages or out of been verified of every possible email address and every possible cell phone number, and we try it. And we keep trying it until it's either disconnected or someone's like, I'm not who you're looking for, or we get a response. And so I've had to sort of talk really openly with my team about, it's really natural to feel like, gosh, I'm imposing on someone, or I feel so anxious about just sending a random text to these 8 numbers right now that may or may not belong to this guy named whatever. But a lot of that has allowed for us to have breakthroughs with people. A lot of times when you do reach, when one of those 8 numbers does work, someone's like, I haven't heard from you in forever. And you're like, great, we want to talk to you. I don't know. I've had to push myself beyond some sort of, I think, very natural fears around putting myself out there. And it's been good to be able to do that in tandem with other people and to encourage them to do the same.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These kind of tips and tricks are super helpful, but also just knowing how much your team has your back, right, is important. The story you shared with us of the school and the history and all the ways that you're working to kind of innovatively solve that fundraising puzzle so that you can continue to be accessible for the boys that you serve is truly, truly amazing. So, Christopher, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to NAIS Member Voices. You can find some related NAIS resources from this episode by visiting nais.org/member voices. You can also keep an eye on that page for information about past and upcoming episodes. Please be sure to subscribe to Member Voices wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode, and go back and listen to previous episodes you might have missed. If you have feedback for us, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to let us know how we're doing. You can also send us your thoughts and suggestions on what you'd like to hear on a future podcast by emailing membership@nais.org.